At 18, she was given to the prince as punishment, but found love instead. The church bell tolls. A carriage rattles through the cobbled streets. Inside, a young girl clutches a rosary, her eyes filled with fear. She's been torn from her family, paraded as a gift of shame before the court. But when the prince looks upon her, the hall falls silent. He does not touch her. He does not laugh. Instead, he defies the whispers, placing her at his side. And that's when everything changes. Behind gilded walls, kindness turns to affection, and affection sparks into forbidden love. Yet danger lurks in every shadow, the Queen Mother's cold eyes, the threat of a forced marriage, and whispers of witchcraft ready to destroy her. What happens when a girl meant for punishment dares to capture the prince's heart? And when the court demands her ruin, will love be her downfall or her redemption? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The autumn wind whipped across the village square as Clara Weiss stood before the local magistrate, her heart pounding beneath her simple wool dress. The morning sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows, highlighting the sneers and suspicious glances from the assembled nobility. You dare speak back to your betters? The baron's steward pointed an accusing finger at Clara, his face red with manufactured outrage. This common miller's daughter thinks herself above her station. Clara's hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. Please, my lord, I meant no disrespect. I only wish to explain about the flower delivery. Laughter rippled through the courtroom. A noblewoman in silk whispered behind her fan to her companion, loud enough for Clara to hear. How bold these peasants have become. The baron himself sat high upon his carved wooden chair, his expression cold as he studied the young woman before him. At 18 years old, Clara stood straight back despite her fear, her father's teachings of dignity evident in her bearing. Silence. The baron's voice cut through the murmurs. Your very manner of speech betrays your pride, girl. You forget your place addressing your superiors with such articulation. He spat the last word as if it were poison. Clara's father, Hans Weiss, stepped forward from the crowd, his miller's cap clutched in weathered hands. My lord, please. My daughter is a good girl, dutiful, and apparently too well educated for her own good, the baron interrupted. Who taught you to read, girl? The parish priest, my lord, Clara answered truthfully. To study scripture. More whispers filled the chamber. The baron's lips curved into a cruel smile. Then perhaps a lesson in humility is required. One that will serve as a warning to all who forget the natural order of things. Clara's stomach twisted as the baron gestured to his clerk. The scratching of quill on parchment filled the tense silence. As the sentence was recorded, Clara Weiss, the baron pronounced, you are hereby sentenced to be sent to the royal court, where you shall be presented as a gift to His Highness Prince Leopold. Let your fate serve as a reminder of the price of peasant pride. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Clara's mother released a choked sob from where she stood with the other villagers. To be sent to court as a punishment gift was a sentence worse than the stocks, or even a public whipping. It meant permanent separation from family, from everything familiar and safe. My lord, please. Hans Weiss fell to his knees. Our mill the village needs. Your mill will continue to operate, the baron cut in sharply, so long as you accept this judgment without further protest. Unless you prefer to see it burned. Clara watched her father's shoulders slump in defeat. The family mill had fed and clothed them for generations. Its loss would mean poverty, not just for them, but for the entire village that depended on it. She straightened her spine, fighting back tears. I accept the sentence. My lord, she said quietly. The baron's clerk finished writing with a flourish, sprinkling sand over the wet ink before rolling the parchment. Red wax dripped onto the document, and the baron pressed his seal ring into it with deliberate force. Take her away, he commanded. Within the hour, Clara found herself in a carriage, 2 armed guards riding alongside. She had been allowed only moments to embrace her parents and gather a small bundle of belongings. Her mother had pressed her rosary into Clara's hands, its wooden beads smooth from years of prayers. The carriage journey stretched across 2 days, each clip-clop of the horse's hooves carrying her further from everything she had ever known. Clara sat in anxious silence, watching through the window as the landscape transformed. The familiar fields and forests of her home gave way to broader highways, then to the increasingly grand estates of the nobility. She had never traveled more than 10 miles from her village. Now, with each passing hour, the differences between her humble life and the world she was entering became starker. Simple cottages were replaced by elegant manors. Working folk in homespun gave way to nobles in fine carriages, their elaborate clothes a riot of silk and lace. The capital city itself took Clara's breath away, despite her fear. Spires and domes rose against the sky. Streets teemed with more people than she had ever seen, and the very air seemed to smell of wealth and power. The royal castle dominated everything, its massive walls and towers looming larger as they approached. Dusk was falling as the carriage finally passed through the outer gates. Torches flickered in iron brackets, casting dancing shadows across the courtyard's cobblestones. Clara's fingers wrapped tightly around her mother's rosary, its familiar contours her only comfort as the carriage drew to a halt. One of the guards dismounted and approached a pair of elaborately uniformed men, standing at attention before the castle's main entrance. "The punishment gift for His Highness," he announced, his voice echoing in the gathering darkness. Clara closed her eyes and drew a deep breath, gathering every scrap of courage she possessed. Whatever humiliation awaited her beyond those towering doors, she would face it with the quiet strength her parents had taught her. The rosary beads pressed into her palm, a silent reminder that even here, in this place of power and pride, God still watched over Miller's daughters. Outside the carriage, she could hear the guards discussing her arrival, their voices carrying clearly in the evening air. She was to be presented to the Queen Mother first, they said, as all gifts to the prince must pass her inspection. Clara suppressed a shiver that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. The carriage door opened. A liveried footman held out his hand, his expression carefully blank as he assisted her down onto the cobblestones. Clara clutched her small bundle of belongings and her rosary, acutely aware of how plain her best dress looked against the grandeur surrounding her. "Come," one of the castle guards commanded, not unkindly. "The Queen Mother awaits." Clara lifted her chin and stepped forward, each footfall carrying her deeper into a world where every virtue she had been taught, honesty, dignity, faith, would be tested against the gilded corruption of court. The massive castle doors swung open before her, and she crossed the threshold, leaving behind forever the simple life she had known. The last rays of sunset painted the castle windows in shades of purple and gold, but to Clara they looked like prison bars. The guard's announcement still rang in her ears, the punishment gift for His Highness. She offered up a silent prayer, her mother's rosary warm in her grasp. As the doors closed behind her with a sound like destiny, the great dining hall blazed with hundreds of candles, their light reflecting off golden plates and crystal goblets. Clara stood trembling at the entrance, flanked by 2 palace guards. The rich aroma of roasted meats and fresh bread made her empty stomach ache, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since morning. "The punishment gift from Baron Werner's court," announced the herald, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. All conversation ceased. Dozens of painted faces turned to stare at Clara, who fought the urge to shrink back from their scrutiny. Ladies hidden behind fancy fans whispered to each other, their eyes gleaming with cruel anticipation. Several gentlemen smirked openly, already speculating about the scandal to come. At the head table, the Queen Mother sat rigid in her throne-like chair, her gray hair arranged in an elaborate style beneath a jeweled headpiece. Her cold gaze traveled over Clara's simple dress and unadorned hair with obvious disdain. A satisfied smile played at the corners of her thin lips as she turned to watch her son's reaction. Prince Leopold sat beside her, his attention fixed on the book propped beside his barely touched plate. At the herald's announcement, he looked up, his expression unreadable. Clara felt the weight of his steady gaze and forced herself to stand straight, though her hands trembled where they were clasped before her. "Come forward, girl," the Queen Mother commanded, her voice sharp with authority. Clara walked slowly between the long tables, feeling the heat of countless stares. Her rough shoes seemed too loud on the polished floor. When she reached the dais, she dropped into a deep curtsy, keeping her eyes lowered as she had been taught. "Your Highness," she murmured. "Well, Leopold," the Queen Mother said, her tone heavy with suggestion. "What do you make of your gift?" The prince stood, his chair scraping against the floor. The silence in the hall grew thick with anticipation. Clara's heart hammered so hard she feared everyone must hear it. "This is meant as my punishment?" Leopold's voice was quiet but carried clearly. "To dishonor an innocent girl for sport?" Nervous titters broke out among the courtiers. The Queen Mother's smile faltered slightly. "My son, surely you understand." "I understand perfectly, Mother." Leopold's tone grew firmer. "But I will not play the beast they wish me to be." He addressed Clara directly. "Look at me, please." Clara raised her eyes to meet his. Where she expected to find contempt, she saw only quiet dignity. "You will serve as my personal attendant," he declared. "You will tend to my chambers, my correspondence, and my daily needs with the respect due your position." Nothing more. A wave of shocked whispers swept through the hall. The Queen Mother's face darkened with fury, but she held her tongue before the assembled court. "Guard," Leopold called. "Escort Miss Weiss to my chambers. Have the housekeeper provide proper servant's attire and explain her duties." Later that evening, Clara knelt by the hearth in the prince's private chambers, arranging her borrowed blanket on the floor where she would sleep. The room was grand but austere, lined with books rather than ornaments. A single candle burned on the massive desk where Leopold sat in his dressing gown, shuffling through papers. She could hear him rise and begin pacing behind her, his soft boots crossing the thick carpet again and again. Though he likely thought her asleep, his muttered words reached her clearly. "They would have me a beast. I shall not oblige them." Clara lay still, watching the fire's shadows dance across the stones. For the first time since her arrest, she felt something other than fear. A tiny spark of hope. The palace bells chimed 4 times as Clara woke from her makeshift bed by the hearth. Her muscles ached from the hard floor, but she rose quickly, knowing her duties would begin with the dawn. She straightened her simple gray dress and tied her hair neatly beneath a white cap before hurrying to the kitchens. The vast kitchen buzzed with activity as servants prepared for the day ahead. Clara collected the prince's morning chocolate, arranging the delicate porcelain cup and saucer on a silver tray. Her hands trembled slightly as she carried it up the winding servant stairs to his chambers. "Your Highness," she called softly, entering after his quiet response. "Your chocolate, sir." Prince Leopold sat at his desk, already dressed in his nightshirt and robe. Papers were scattered before him, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He barely glanced up as she set down the tray. "The council meets at 9 o'clock, he said, his voice low and tired. "I require the blue coat with silver trim." "Yes, Your Highness." Clara moved to the massive wardrobe, selecting the requested garments with care. As she laid out each piece, she noticed they were well made, but plain compared to the gaudy fashions she had seen in court. Their morning routine continued in this way for several days. Brief exchanges, careful movements. But Clara began to notice small things. How he always thanked her quietly. How he never threw his clothes about like other nobles. How he made sure a plate of bread and cheese appeared by her blanket each night. One evening, while carrying fresh linens, Clara discovered a hidden door behind a tapestry. Curiosity overcame her caution, and she peered inside. Books lined the walls of the small chamber, their leather spines gleaming in the dim light. A single chair stood near a window, and scattered papers covered a small desk. She couldn't resist. Taking a candle, she selected a volume of scripture and began to read aloud softly, her finger tracing the familiar words. "Be not proud of heart, but humble in spirit. You can read." Clara jumped at Prince Leopold's voice, nearly dropping the book. He stood in the doorway, but his expression held curiosity rather than anger. "Forgive me, Your Highness," she stammered, closing the book. "I should not have." "Continue," he said, surprising her. He moved to sit in the chair, his eyes watchful but not unkind. "Please." Heart pounding, Clara reopened the book and began reading again. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, the familiar verses bringing comfort. Despite her nervousness after that evening, a new pattern emerged. As Leopold worked at his desk, Clara would read aloud from various texts, histories, philosophies, religious works. Sometimes he would ask her thoughts on a passage, and she would answer honestly, if hesitantly. "You speak with unusual clarity for one of your station," he remarked one evening. "My father believed all God's children should know his word," Clara replied. "He taught me letters by candlelight after long days at the mill," Leopold nodded thoughtfully. "A wise man, your father." Days passed and their conversations grew longer, though always proper. They discussed the nature of duty, the weight of responsibility, the meaning of true nobility. Clara found herself sharing simple wisdom learned at her father's knee, while Leopold revealed his struggles with court politics and his mother's demanding expectations. One evening, during the formal supper in the great hall, Clara moved quietly among the other servants, filling wine glasses. As she passed behind Leopold's chair, she felt his eyes follow her. When she dared to glance up, she met his gaze across the crowded room. For the first time since her arrival, a small smile touched his lips. The warmth of that smile seemed to spread through her chest, making her heart beat faster. She quickly looked down at her picture, but the feeling remained, a strange, wonderful fluttering that both frightened and thrilled her. Whispers followed Clara through the palace corridors like autumn leaves rustling in the wind. Ladies with powdered faces turned away as she passed, hiding smirks behind delicate fans. Their painted lips moved in hushed mockery, their words carrying just far enough for her to hear. "Did you see how he looks at her during supper? A common miller's daughter, reading his private books. Mark my words, she'll be ruined before winter comes." Clara kept her eyes downcast, clutching fresh linens to her chest as she hurried past. The weight of their stares pressed upon her shoulders, but she refused to let them see her pain. In the kitchen, the cook crossed herself whenever Clara entered, muttering prayers under her breath. "God protect you, child," the old woman whispered one morning, pressing a small loaf of bread into Clara's hands. His last servant girl vanished without a trace, but Clara knew better. The prince they whispered about bore no resemblance to the man she served each day, the one whose fingers moved so carefully over his books, who thanked her quietly for every small service. Queen Mother's voice rang through the private study one afternoon, sharp as breaking glass. Clara froze outside the door, Leopold's freshly pressed cravat in her hands. "This common girl has addled your wits." The queen's silk skirts rustled as she paced. "The Duchess of Württemberg has expressed interest. She brings 3 counties and a fortune in gold. Yet you waste time with this peasant." "Mother," Leopold's voice was quiet but firm, "I will not dispose of her like unwanted furniture." "You disappoint me, Leopold. Your father would never have." "I am not my father." The words cut through the air like steel. "The girl stays." "That is final." Clara's heart thundered in her chest as footsteps approached. She barely managed to step aside as the Queen Mother swept past, her face flushed with anger. That evening, as Clara laid the fire in Leopold's chambers, the sweet notes of a harpsichord drifted through the room. She had never heard him play before. The melody was haunting and delicate, like raindrops on glass. "Clara," His voice startled her. The music had stopped. "Yes, Your Highness? You need not kneel by the hearth while I play. Take the chair, if you wish." She hesitated, then settled into the velvet chair near his instrument. In the candlelight, she saw something new in his face, a softness, a vulnerability she had never noticed before. His fingers rested motionless on the keys. "They say music speaks what words cannot," he said quietly, almost to himself. Sometimes the silence of these rooms becomes too heavy to bear. Clara's heart ached at the loneliness in his voice. This was not the cold prince of court gossip, but a man surrounded by luxury, yet starved for genuine companionship. He began to play again, a gentle melody that filled the chamber with warmth. When the last note faded, Clara realized tears had gathered in her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed. "Thank you," she whispered, rising to return to her duties. That night, lying on her narrow cot by the dying embers, Clara stared into the darkness. The evening's music still echoed in her mind, along with the memory of Leopold's unguarded expression as he played. "He is not the monster they paint," she whispered to herself, fingers tracing the rough wool of her blanket. "He is kind." The word settled in her chest like a warm ember, both comforting and frightening in its truth. She pulled the blanket closer, trying to ignore the way her heart quickened at the thought of tomorrow's dawn, when she would see him again. The great hall blazed with 100 beeswax candles, their light dancing off golden platters and crystal goblets. Nobles in their finest silks and velvets gathered for the autumn feast, celebrating the harvest with the abundance that only the royal court could provide. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted meats, fresh bread, and spiced wine. Clara moved quietly among the servants, her plain brown dress marking her station. She carried a silver pitcher of wine, carefully making her way toward the raised dais where Prince Leopold sat with his mother and the highest-ranking guests. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached, aware of the Queen Mother's cold gaze following her every move. "Come closer, Miss Weiss," Leopold's voice carried clearly across the dais. The surrounding conversations hushed. "You shall not serve this evening." Clara froze, uncertain. "Your Highness?" "There is an empty seat here," Leopold gestured to his left side, where indeed a chair stood vacant. His voice was firm but gentle. "You will join us." A wave of gasps rippled through the hall. The Queen Mother's face turned pale with fury. Clara's heart thundered in her chest as nobles began to whisper furiously behind their hands. "Please, Your Highness," Clara protested in a whisper. "I cannot, 'tis not proper, I insist," Leopold said, rising slightly to pull out the chair himself. The gesture sent another shockwave through the assembly. "You have proven yourself more worthy of conversation than half the court." Clara felt hundreds of eyes boring into her as she carefully set down her pitcher. With trembling fingers, she smoothed her simple dress, painfully aware of its contrast to the elaborate gown surrounding her. Leopold himself helped her to her seat, his hand warm and steady against hers. "Your Highness," the Queen Mother's voice cut through the whispers like ice. "This is most irregular." "Indeed, Mother," Leopold replied calmly, taking his own seat again. "How refreshing." Servants brought plate after plate of delicacies. Clara had only ever served before roasted pheasant with golden brown skin, delicate pastries filled with cream, fruits preserved in honey. Leopold spoke to her throughout the meal, asking her thoughts on books they had discussed, listening intently to her careful responses. Gradually, some of the tension in the room eased. A few of the younger nobles, following their prince's lead, ventured to include Clara in their conversations. She found herself speaking of village harvest traditions, and to her surprise, several ladies showed genuine interest in her descriptions of country life. Yet fear coiled in her stomach like a serpent. She could feel the hatred radiating from the Queen Mother, see the calculating looks from ambitious courtiers. This one evening of equality would have consequences, she knew. Still, she could not help savoring every moment, the taste of fine wine, the warmth of Leopold's smile, the simple joy of being treated as worthy. As the feast drew to a close and guests began to disperse, Clara slipped away from the dais with a deep curtsy. She hurried through torchlit corridors to her small chamber near the servants' quarters, her mind whirling with the evening's events. The room was cold and dark, but she did not light a candle. Instead, she went to the narrow window where stars glittered in the autumn sky like diamonds scattered on velvet. The moon cast a silver glow over the palace gardens below. Clara pressed her hand to her heart, feeling its quick beats beneath her fingers. "I cannot deny it," she whispered to the stars, her voice barely a breath in the darkness. "I love him." The words, once spoken, seemed to hang in the air like frost. They changed everything and nothing. She was still a miller's daughter, and he was still a prince. But for one shining evening, the distance between their worlds had vanished, leaving only two hearts beating in harmony, the Queen Mother's. Silk skirts rustled like angry whispers as she swept into her private drawing room. Candlelight gleamed off the gilt frames of ancestral portraits as she gathered her most trusted allies, three elderly duchesses and Count Reinhardt, whose cold eyes spoke of calculation rather than warmth. "This peasant girl has bewitched my son for too long," the Queen Mother declared, pacing before the crackling hearth. "He refuses suitable matches while this miller's daughter holds his attention." Count Reinhardt cleared his throat, his jeweled rings catching the firelight as he gestured. "Your Grace, perhaps I might offer a solution. I have long sought a young bride to manage my household. The girl would be far from court, unable to distract the prince further." The Queen Mother's thin lips curved into a smile. "Indeed, Count Reinhardt, you would do the crown a great service." She turned to her ladies. "Have the girl brought to me at once." Clara arrived minutes later, her simple dark dress a stark contrast to the opulent chamber. Her heart pounded as she curtsied, feeling the weight of hostile stares. "Girl," the Queen Mother's voice cut like winter frost, "you will marry Count Reinhardt within the month. The banns will be read tomorrow." Clara's face paled. "Your Grace, I cannot." The Queen Mother's laugh held no mirth. "You are a servant, child. You have no choice in this matter." "Please," Clara whispered, her hands trembling. "I beg you, silence." The Queen Mother rose, towering over her. "You forget your place. This marriage is decided. Count Reinhardt has graciously offered to take you, despite your common blood. You will show proper gratitude." Clara stared at the Count, whose aged face held neither kindness nor compassion. His eyes roamed over her like a merchant appraising goods. She felt sick to her stomach. "I would rather join a convent," Clara said softly, but firmly. "That is not your choice to make," the Queen Mother snapped. "The wedding preparations begin tomorrow. You are dismissed." Word of the arranged marriage spread through the palace like wildfire. When Prince Leopold heard the news from his valet, his hands clenched into fists. He had seen how Count Reinhardt treated his servants, how his previous wives had faded away like autumn leaves. Leopold strode to his writing desk, determination in every step. By candlelight, he penned a letter to his father, the king, who was away on diplomatic matters. His quill scratched urgently across the parchment as he detailed Clara's virtues, her intelligence, her gentle spirit. He wrote of the injustice of forcing her into a loveless marriage with a cruel man thrice her age, but the Queen Mother's spies were everywhere. Before the letter could leave the palace, it was intercepted and brought to her chambers. She read it with growing fury, then cast it into the fire, watching the edges blacken and curl. "My son grows too bold," she murmured to herself. "This marriage must proceed quickly before he can interfere further." As evening fell, Clara sought solace in the palace chapel. The sacred space was empty save for the eternal flame flickering before the altar. She knelt on the cold stone floor, her tears falling silently as she clutched her mother's rosary. "Dear God," she whispered, her voice breaking, Grant me strength to endure what I cannot change. How can I marry a man I do not love? How can I leave? She could not finish the thought, could not speak the prince's name even in prayer. The chapel candles burned lower, their light growing dim. Clara remained on her knees, her prayers becoming desperate pleas as darkness gathered in the corners of the sacred space. Her tears fell onto the ancient stones, joining countless others who had knelt here before her, seeking divine intervention in their darkest hours. In the growing shadows, she wept for her lost freedom, for the cruel twist of fate that had brought her to this moment, and for the love she dared not name. Even in the privacy of her own heart, the midnight bells had barely finished tolling when heavy boots thundered down the servants' corridor. Clara startled awake as her chamber door burst open, flooding the small room with harsh torchlight. 2 royal guards towered in the doorway, their faces grim beneath their plumed helmets. "Up with you, witch!" The taller guard grabbed her arm roughly. Clara could only clutch her thin nightdress around herself as they dragged her from her narrow bed. "Please, what is happening?" she gasped, stumbling as they hauled her through the dark hallways. Her bare feet scraped against the cold stone floors. "Silence. You'll have plenty to say before the priest, sorceress." The second guard's grip tightened painfully on her other arm. The commotion drew servants from their chambers. Kitchen maids and footmen peered fearfully from doorways, making quick signs of the cross as Clara was pulled past. Their faces showed pity, but none dared speak in her defense. From above came the sound of running feet and a familiar voice. "What is the meaning of this?" Prince Leopold's commanding tone rang through the corridor. Clara's heart leaped, but before she could call out, the guards hurried her down a twisting stair toward the dungeons. Behind them, she heard Leopold's protests cut short by his advisors. "Your Highness must not interfere. Think of your position, your succession. This is madness." Leopold's fury echoed off the stones. "I demand, the investigation must proceed according to law, Your Highness," came a smooth reply. "Even you cannot override matters of faith." The guards thrust Clara through an iron-bound door into the castle's depths. The dungeon air struck her like a physical blow, damp and heavy with the scent of mold and suffering. They pushed her into a cramped cell where a single guttering torch cast writhing shadows on the walls. She had barely caught her breath when the questioning began. A stern-faced priest entered, flanked by 2 richly dressed courtiers whose elegant clothes seemed out of place in the gloom. "You stand accused of practicing witchcraft," the priest intoned, "of using unholy arts to bewitch His Highness Prince Leopold." "That is not true," Clara protested. "I have done nothing. Silence." One of the courtiers stepped forward. "We have proof of your wickedness. You, a common miller's daughter, dare to read and speak of Holy Scripture? Where did such knowledge come from, if not dark powers?" "I learned from my mother, from our village priest," Clara began. But the interrogators spoke over her. Hour after hour, they questioned her, twisting her every answer. Her love of reading became proof of forbidden learning. Her knowledge of psalms and verses was declared evidence of demonic influence. Even her simple prayers were cast as incantations. No peasant girl could speak such words without evil aid, the priest declared. "Your very presence in the castle is an abomination." When dawn's weak light finally crept through the high window, they left her alone in the cell. Clara sank onto the damp straw, her throat raw from defending herself. Her fingers found her mother's rosary, still hanging at her neck, the one precious thing they had not taken from her. In the silence, broken only by distant drips of water, Clara pressed the smooth beads to her lips. "Dear Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling but determined, "even if the world condemns me, He knows my heart." The familiar words of prayer brought comfort. Even here in the darkness that she thought of Leopold, of the gentleness in his eyes when they spoke of books and faith. No witchcraft had drawn them together, only 2 lonely souls finding understanding. But how could she prove that to those who had already decided her guilt? Clara closed her eyes, clutching the rosary tighter. In the cold and shadows of her cell, she began to pray not for rescue, but for strength to face whatever morning might bring. The great hall loomed vast and shadowy in the pre-dawn darkness, lit only by dozens of flickering torches along its stone walls. Nobles had been summoned from their beds, and they gathered in their hastily donned finery, whispering behind jeweled fans and elegant sleeves, their eager eyes fixed on the heavy wooden doors as they slowly creaked open. Clara entered between her two guards, her face pale but composed. Her simple nightdress had been replaced with a coarse gray shift, the garb of the accused. Though her wrists were bound with rough rope, she held her head high, her mother's rosary clutched tightly in her trembling fingers. "Behold the witch," announced the court herald, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Clara Weiss stands accused of practicing dark arts to bewitch His Highness Prince Leopold." The Queen Mother sat upon her ornate chair on the dais, her silver-streaked hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. Her thin lips curved in a satisfied smile as she watched, Clara being led to the center of the hall. "Bring forth the witnesses," commanded the chief priest, his black robes rustling as he stepped forward. One by one, they came. A kitchen maid testified with downcast eyes that she had seen Clara muttering strange words over the prince's morning chocolate. The head gardener claimed to have found suspicious herbs in Clara's chamber. A nobleman's daughter swore she had seen Clara dancing barefoot in the castle gardens under a full moon. Clara's heart sank as she recognized faces she had considered friendly servants she had shared bread with, nobles she had served at table. Now they avoided her gaze as they spoke their practiced lies, their palms heavy with the Queen Mother's gold. "I have seen enough," the Queen Mother declared, rising from her seat. Her voice rang with authority. "The evidence is clear. This common girl has used witchcraft to corrupt the mind of my son, to turn him against his noble duties and proper marriage prospects. I declare her guilty." Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. The chief priest stepped forward, his face grave beneath his hood. "Then by the authority vested in me," the great doors suddenly burst open with a thunderous crash that made the torches flutter. Prince Leopold strode in, resplendent in his full royal regalia, golden crown gleaming on his brow, ceremonial sword at his hip, ermine-trimmed cape sweeping behind him. A contingent of loyal guards flanked him, their polished armor reflecting the torchlig. The crowd parted before him like water. Clara's heart leaped at the sight of him, even as fear for his safety gripped her chest. "Your Highness," the Queen Mother's voice turned honey-sweet, "you need not trouble yourself with this unpleasant business. We have the matter well in hand." "Silence!" Leopold's command rang through the hall. He reached Clara's side in swift strides, his boots echoing on the stone floor. "You dare to hold this farce of a trial without my knowledge? You dare to accuse this innocent woman of witchcraft?" "The evidence," began the priest, but Leopold cut him off with a sharp gesture. "If Clara Weiss is guilty of witchcraft," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall, "then I stand equally condemned. For if she has bewitched me, it was not through dark arts, but through the pure magic of her virtuous heart." A collective gasp rose from the assembled nobles. The Queen Mother's face turned pale with fury. Leopold turned to face the crowd, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "This woman's only crime was to show me what true nobility means, not the accident of birth, but the quality of one's character. If her goodness has redeemed me from the cold prince you all feared, then let that be her sentence." The great hall fell into a heavy silence as Prince Leopold strode forward. His boots echoed against the stone floor as he approached the throne where his father sat. Without hesitation, he lowered himself to one knee, his rich velvet cloak pooling around him. "Father," Leopold's voice rang clear and strong through the hushed chamber, "I beg you to show mercy. Clara Weiss stands accused not for any crime of witchcraft, but for the simple act of awakening virtue in my heart." The Queen Mother's face twisted with rage. "This is precisely the proof of her sorcery. No common miller's daughter could—" "Peace!" The king raised his hand, his lined face thoughtful as he studied his son. The countless candles cast dancing shadows across his graying temples. "Let the prince speak." Leopold drew a deep breath, his shoulders straight with determination. "Since Clara's arrival, I have found myself changed not by spells or charms, but by her example. While others sought to curry favor, she showed only honest dignity. When tested with cruelty, she responded with grace. She has taught me that true nobility lies not in birth, but in character." Clara stood trembling, tears gathering in her eyes as Leopold continued. "I love her, father. Not as a prince's passing fancy, but as a man who has finally understood what honor means. She has given me the courage to be worthy of the crown I will one day wear." The king leaned forward, his throne creaking softly. His gaze drifted to Clara, who met his eyes with quiet strength despite her fear. In her face, he saw something that stirred old memories, memories of his own youth, before decades of courtly scheming had hardened his heart. "I have watched this court grow corrupt with flattery and lies," the king said slowly, his voice heavy with weariness. "I have seen honest hearts twisted by ambition, and virtue mocked as weakness." He paused, looking between his son and the trembling girl. "Perhaps it is time for change, Your Majesty." The Queen Mother rose, her silk skirts rustling. "You cannot possibly." "I can, and I shall." The king's voice grew firm. Clara Weiss stepped forward. Clara approached the throne, her simple gray shift a stark contrast to the splendor around her. The guards moved to follow, but the king waved them back. "I find no evil in you," he declared. "By my authority as king, I hereby pardon you of all charges. Furthermore," he continued as murmurs of shock rippled through the hall, "I declare null and void any arrangement for your marriage to Count Aldrich. You shall be free to choose your own path." The Queen Mother's face had gone pale with fury. She gripped the arm of her chair so tightly her knuckles showed white, but she dared not speak against the king's direct decree. "Remove her bonds," the king commanded. A guard hurried forward with a knife, cutting through the rough ropes that bound Clara's wrists. She rubbed them gently, still scarcely believing what was happening. Leopold rose from his knee and crossed to where Clara stood. Before the entire court, he took her hand in his touch gentle but firm. Clara's fingers trembled within his grasp, but her eyes shone with joy as she looked up at him. "My son," the king said softly, "you have chosen well." The nobles watched in stunned silence as Leopold led Clara from the center of the hall, her small hand still clasped in his. Some faces showed disgust, others curiosity, and a few, particularly among the younger courtiers, displayed something that looked remarkably like hope. The Queen Mother remained rigid in her chair, her dreams of a politically advantageous marriage for her son crumbling to dust. But even her considerable influence could not overcome the king's direct command, and she knew it as they reached the great doors. Leopold paused and looked down at Clara, in full view of everyone. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her fingers. The gesture was both a declaration and a promise. Love had triumphed over artifice, and truth had conquered lies. The cathedral bells rang out clear and joyful across the city on that crisp autumn morning. Sunlight streamed through the ancient stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the stone floors, where nobles and commoners alike gathered for an unprecedented occasion, the wedding of Prince Leopold to Clara Weiss. Outside, the streets overflowed with common folk who had traveled from villages near and far. They pressed close to the cathedral gates, eager to catch a glimpse of the miller's daughter who had won the prince's heart. Their excited chatter filled the morning air with warmth and hope. Inside, the nobles sat stiff-backed in their pews, their rich silks and velvets a riot of color against the dark wood. Some were expressions of barely concealed disdain, while others seemed uncertain how to react to this breaking of centuries of tradition. The Queen Mother sat rigid in the front row, her face a careful mask of composure. When the cathedral doors opened, a hush fell over the gathering. Clara appeared in the doorway, radiant in a gown of ivory silk. Her father, the miller, stood proudly at her side, his weathered hand trembling slightly as it held her arm. Gone was the gray servant's dress and the rope-burned wrists. In its place stood a woman whose quiet strength had changed the very heart of the kingdom. As Clara walked down the aisle, her steps measured and graceful, the morning light caught the simple gold cross at her throat, the same one she had clutched during her darkest hours in the dungeon. Her face glowed not with triumph, but with the same gentle dignity that had first captured Leopold's attention. At the altar, Prince Leopold waited, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. When she reached him, he extended his hand, helping her up the steps with tender care. The Archbishop began the ceremony, his voice echoing through the vast space as he spoke of love's power to transform hearts and unite what custom had divided. The exchange of vows was simple but profound. Clara's clear voice carried to every corner as she promised her heart and faith to Leopold. The prince's own voice shook slightly with emotion as he pledged himself to her, before God and all witnesses. Later, at the wedding supper, hundreds of candles bathed the great hall in golden light. The tables groaned with delicacies, while musicians played soft melodies from the gallery above. Clara sat beside Leopold at the high table, taking in the scene with quiet wonder. The same hall that had witnessed her trial now celebrated her marriage. Leopold turned to her, his eyes soft with love. Taking her hand in his, he raised it gently to his lips. "At 18 they gave you as punishment," he whispered, his breath warm against her fingers. "But you became my redemption." Clara's heart swelled with gratitude as she gazed at her husband, remembering how far they had come from those first fearful days. God had indeed worked mysteries through their love, turning punishment into blessing and fear into joy. Thank you for watching. Stories like this remind us who we are. If something touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another story that just might stay with you.